Hi, my name's Ed Fry. I'm president of ACC, and thank you for joining us this evening. We have hopefully a very lively conversation with some great guests. Just to tee this up, a few housekeeping issues before we get started. Please remain muted unless you are speaking. We'll take some questions at the end of the program, but otherwise, please keep your microphone on silent. There will be a chat box that you can enter questions into. We will try to address those as we go along, and certainly at the end, and then we'll open up, time permitting, we'll open up the mic and have some live questions as well. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to have four really extraordinary guests with us today. Dr. Sam Wan, who is actually a retired cardiologist, and I had the good fortune of working with in the Ascension system and have known Sam for many years. Melissa Wood, who is the chair of the Board of Governors and professor of medicine and cardiology at Harvard. At Mass General, George Vetrovic, who is the chair of the senior cardiology section and an interventional cardiologist, and my good friend and neighbor, Dr. Dick Kovacs, former president of ACC and now ACC chief medical officer. The subject today is to talk a little bit about the latter part of one's career and senior cardiologists and the very valuable role that this part of the college or this constituency, which is the most rapidly growing part of the college actually, can play in terms of clinical practice and other things that they can do. And this is a good bookend to what we talked about in our last session, which was about fellowship training. So this is at the other end of the career spectrum. So we'll really sort of see both ends of the career path. So I mentioned that senior cardiology is the fastest growing in in the entire college. It's estimated that there are more than 26%, 25% of our membership are over the age of 61. Well over 10% are over 70. Average age of a cardiologist is 57. And it is estimated that there may be retirement of over 1,000 cardiologists per year, and with a relatively fixed number of trainees, that we may be losing over 500 cardiologists each year, and over the next 10 years can expect to lose 5,000 cardiologists. So that gives you some perspective. So Sam and George, you're both very engaged in the senior cardiology section. Tell us a little bit about the section and why it's important to the college, and what important things can members find in your section.
Yes, it works better when you're on mute. Sam, you be sure to break in quickly whenever I get things wrong. Sam really gets credit for starting this a few years ago, and I've sort of followed in his footsteps. And I think it's been sort of interesting. You know, you said you had the younger group to start with, and you think about all the possibilities for their lives. Well, when you come to the end of the career, there are still lots of possibilities of what you can do. And our section has people that have switched over to do consulting or working with industry or doing clinics, free clinics, or doing some mentoring. And there are just lots of options. And frankly, we've been trying to look at how we can meet those needs to help educate people and what the options are and make them feel a little bit better about it. I personally think a lot of us of this age range are a little um, uncomfortable thinking about not working every day or whatever. And so we've done that. But I think one of the things that I've become aware of acutely is that not everybody wants to quit. I mean, you sort of say, oh, well, they're 65, they want to quit. They really don't. We did a little survey of the section about a year ago, and it turned out that when you said, well, if you're not retired, when do you want to retire? And it came out 70 to 75 and so forth. So I think the other thing we are looking at is how we can support people who want to continue in their careers. And, that gets complicated in many of the health systems as to whether you can be part time or not, so forth. So I think there are just huge opportunities, and we're trying to meet the needs, which are varied, of this population.
So Sam, how do you view that? And is there when we say people want to continue working, do they want to continue working full time, taking full call, or are they looking to change what they do or change the intensity of what they do?
Well, I mean, thanks for bringing up the subject. I think George outlined it very well. To answer your question directly, I think for those of us who might want to continue practicing, there are major barriers, and they deal with the fact that if you stop taking call, your salary drops in half, and they show you the door. It's not pretty. The way we salary one another, and at least in private practice, I would say that bigger institutions and academics may be somewhat more friendly, and it's not friendly is not the right word. These are good guys, but no one likes call, and no one wants to work weekends, and I think that's a big barrier. The other perspective I will introduce to you, I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico a couple of years ago, and meet lots of retired people here in different from different professions, but medically, one of my fellows, when your fellows start to retire, you know you're old. So one of my cardiologists here, who happens to be my cardiologist, is getting ready to retire, and he wanted to go job share with another guy of a similar age, and it's a big problem to do that. Anyway, the problem here is the shortage that Ed mentioned is desperate in rural New Mexico. I mean, you cannot find a cardiologist for 100 miles in any direction, and the quality of care that's delivered to some of these people is just embarrassing, and it's going to get worse. And I don't think the answer is keeping us old guys in the saddle, maybe, but there are some answers. And I think team-based care is one that has occurred during my career that I don't need to be in charge of everything. It's I'll need to shut up here, but it's not my patient, it's our patient, and to having me be responsible 24/7 for a patient. Well, we used to do that. Used to be solo cardiologist in Indianapolis when I was in training, and we don't. That's just not practical anymore. We need to get over the business of the RVUs and the fee for service medicine. Is what economically is driving a lot of this shortage. Anyway, enough said. I'm looking forward to some answers here. The problems are pretty obvious.
Yeah, we're generally pretty good at describing the problems. We have challenges with the answers, and maybe we'll get some answers. And speaking of which, Melissa, you're the only person who's not a senior cardiologist here, and you are a long way off from being a senior cardiologist, at least chronologically, intellectually, and professionally. You're very much a senior cardiologist, but not chronologically. But you've been exploring some. I mean, tell us a little bit about at Mass General some of the needs, and Sam touched on the shortage issue. Tell us about some of the sort of innovative, creative ways that you're maybe tapping into that really underappreciated resource.
Well, first, I guess I'd like to ask the question, what defines a senior cardiologist?
Good question. So what's the George and Sam, what's the criteria to get into the senior section?
60.
Other than $35 dues, what else do you?
There's no dues, and it's 60. It's age 60.
Oh,
So in
60.
so in 6 months I can join the group. So okay, just so I know.
Well, back at the beginning, we toyed around with different thoughts. Over the Hill Gang was one, just old fogies was another. Senior seemed to be a reasonable compromise. And I think it's senior when you declare yourself senior, actually.
Okay.
Right.
Just wanted to clarify that because I think I'm pretty close. So the other, really to answer sort of Ed's question, one of the things that we have done here is really kind of taking a look across the career span of cardiologists and identifying people's values and interests. And one of the things that we have seen is that a lot of the younger cardiologists want more predictability. So they want to be on the inpatient services and want to spend less time in the outpatient services. And many of our more senior cardiologists are actually interested in doing outpatient as they sort of wind down procedural time because they don't want to be doing all of that call and a lot of cath lab time. And so we've kind of been able to create a model for members of our division that want to continue working, but not at that 55 hours, 60 hours a week, that really want to work in the office. And that has been a great way to meet the needs of our growing access issues, to keep them very fulfilled and challenged and really doing that rewarding work of caring for patients. And that has been something that has been nice for us. Now, I understand that in some private practices, this may not be a solution that works because you need X number of cardiologists to share the call. But at least in a large system where we have many talented, physicians who want to remain active, well into their early 70s, this has been a great way for us to really adapt and also address that access issue. Additionally, we've been able to create teaching pathways where they can get more involved in doing like the fellows report, where they meet weekly with the fellows, because we know our senior cardiologists have an incredible wealth of clinical experience, and many of them have experience that's really founded in skills that may be less common today, such as the detailed physical exam, or how to ask a detailed history and learn so much from our patients. So both those teaching opportunities as well as the pivoting more to the outpatient setting have been ways that we've been able to really adapt to the needs of our senior cardiologists.
That's great. That's great. Dick, in academics, we think of senior cardiology as carrying the title of emeritus, and there may actually be some criteria that go along with emeritus. But in terms of the role of people who are perhaps in the latter part of their career, and maybe they're slowing down in terms of their clinical responsibility, they might have they may still have busy research activity or administrative activity. What are some of the roles that you and your colleagues and others? I know there's a very famous cardiologist in your division who is age 88 and still going great guns. And so there's obviously a broad spectrum as to what really constitutes a senior cardiologist.
I think in academics, first of all, many universities, my own, will have limits on the age of certain positions within, for example, division directors, department chairs have an age limit, and may not be allowed to continue after a certain age. So be aware of those requirements in your individual institutions. But you mentioned um, slowing down, and perhaps that term. I think of it maybe a little bit differently, and some of our I'm going to use a different word, seasoned cardiologists have a more deliberate pace. And as Melissa mentioned, that's ideal for training. Our fellows don't read an echo as fast as a peak productivity RVU generating cardiologist, but to have somebody work with them, to be able to sit side by side for some reading sessions, and to be able to take the time to go through it at a pace where the fellows can really benefit. That's been a big boon to us. Another is the flexibility of these seasoned senior cardiologists, and and Sam mentioned the issues of call, and some of our senior folks, myself included, may not take a full load of call, but anybody who's tried to schedule during a spring break or fall break for schools with kids, with faculty with children of school age. Now, maybe the grandkids are in school, and that's important time too. But you get a lot of flexibility, and then finally, being able to spot stuff. You have a more flexible schedule, and being able to, we've all learned how to be ultimately flexible during the COVID pandemic, and be able to turn on a dime and cover a service, or cover a clinic because somebody is out. But there's lots of other emergencies and things that happen with our junior faculty, and when the senior faculty can, without really breaking a sweat, pivot and say, yeah, I can round for you, tomorrow. Not a problem. I can do that for you. I can spot you that. It really lifts the morale of the whole group.
Yeah. So a lot of contributions that those folks can make that can help their younger partners. And you talked about certainly the vacation aspect, the mentoring aspect, the teaching, really great opportunities for both involved, the younger cardiologist and the senior cardiologist as well. Um, the call issue is a really sticky one, and it sort of goes back to the fact that call was, I mean, what other job in the world sort of tacks on this sort of incredibly intense, demanding part of your work on top of still a full busy schedule? Some of that in the private practice arena is driven by revenue generation and by income and things like that. But it is certainly onerous. And that's probably one of the biggest drivers for people to consider slowing down or retirement. But then there's the sort of the procedural aspect of it. And George, you're a very well-known interventional cardiologist and been very involved in the interventional section. What are some of the considerations that cardiologists who enter the later parts of their career should go through in terms of deciding when to stop taking STEMI call, for example, or stop doing procedures or other procedures, EP or other things? What are some of the considerations that you've seen or has been discussed through the section?
You got to unmute
Yeah, I
again.
think you're on mute there.
An interesting point is that as a culture, I don't think we, as compared to some other cultures, are quite as respecting of age. And so I think there's a little defensiveness on senior cardiologists sometimes in practices and so forth. Um, but I think you can work through a lot of those. One of the things that always seemed to be an issue for me is I didn't mind taking night call, um, but where I was inefficient was the next day. And Melissa, when you talk about some of this almost job sharing or so forth, I'm sure there are many interventional cardiologists be glad to do the next day and and pick up the RVUs and let me do the STEMI call at night, and then I could sleep the next day if I was up all night. So, I think that's a creative way to kind of address some of that call issue and how it might work. So I've always thought that that was a unique opportunity. I think the other parts of doing intervention are you well enough? And some of us have been fortunate enough not to have um, any type of orthopedic problems or so forth that really limited our maybe not ability, but just our getting tired too quickly to be effective and so forth. But others have, and I think we have to be kind of expecting, respecting of that, and support people with that. So I think a lot of it really, hopefully, have leadership that, and hopefully even in the big systems, you have leadership that allows to make reasonable judgments and support people reasonably for what they need and what they can do. And if we don't just kind of take an attitude, oh, he's just an old guy, we can just get rid of him. That'll make a lot of difference. So I think there's a lot on both sides that can be done with this.
Yeah, good points. I mean, age is relative too, right? I mean, there are very, very alluded to with Dick's colleague, very active and productive members despite advanced years. but there may be some actual, physical or visual, or especially in the world of intervention or procedures, where that need to be taken into account. In our institution, we actually have a policy at age 65, if you are doing procedures or surgeries, that you have to have an exam, medical exam at age 65, visual exam every 2 years, neurocognitive test every 2 years, and have a release from your primary care physician. AMA has looked at this, and Sam, I know you've been very involved in AMA, and they went down a path, but then backed off because there was a lot of backlash and sense of ageism, concerns of ageism. To the group, do you have policies in your institutions, or are there any sort of prescribed issues related to when people should be stopping doing procedures?
I'll
We behaved
go
a lot
ahead.
like the AMA. We started down the pathway, but then retreated. So we do not have and I was part of that task force that looked at this, and not just for cardiology, but for proceduralists in general. So it's now on a case by case basis. So your OR director, your cath lab director is I guess responsible for making sure that your skills are your skills.
I think it's difficult to be too dogmatic about this because it does become discriminatory. I know 50-year-olds that may have um, neuropsychiatric problems that should be addressed, and to be to make this a requirement, it's reminiscent of some of the problems with CME and the ABIM recertification program. In general, it sounds like a good idea. In practice, it may fall apart. And to be very personal about it, to keep it in house, and to have a good cohesive group that can adapt, adjust people to adapt to their limitations. But clearly, we have to protect patients. There's no At the end of the day, that's our job, to make sure that if we have people doing things, they are capable of doing them.
Yeah. Melissa, at MGH, what do you do?
So at least in our non-invasive group, we have a policy that's actually favorable, that we offer that anyone over 65 does not have to take inpatient overnight call. And so they can still do, the rotations, but we do spare them taking call. Now, some have declined to take advantage of that, but at least it's offered. And there has been no sort of mandatory step down, slow down in that arena. But there was one person who was still cathing in his 70s, and he voluntarily said, I really want to just go in and help my junior colleagues and sort of use my seasoned eye and my hands if needed, but didn't want to take that primary responsibility for cases. And that was very valuable because he was just such an exceptional individual. And I think many fellows were able to learn from him even in his 70s when he was still cathing, because he wanted to teach the unique skills that he possessed and sort of the procedures that very few other people had actually done. But there was no sort of need to kind of pull him back, because he was really didn't want that. And so it's actually worked out well for us. I see a question in the chat about age discrimination, and I think that's really a question of whether a mandatory policy would be, borderline age discrimination. But since these organizations are largely private, I guess they can make the policies that they want to handle this.
One of the problems that I see is that in big institutions, particularly academics, the salary structure is different than in private practice, which is very much production based compensation. So you cut down on your procedures, you cut down on your salary, and we're just people. Other people are perfectly happy to take up those high revenue thing. Reading echoes, for example, that's a very lucrative thing to do if you can get a bunch of them. So the guys don't want to give them up. That's fairly quote unquote easy work, scheduled work, highly compensated, and why should I give that up?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think lots of different considerations across different programs, and I think probably highlights a lot of it has to do with the culture in your organization and the sort of the history that you've established and probably having a frank having a frank dialogue about it. The bad examples I've seen is when you know nobody talks about it and then there's either a problem or you get into a situation where it becomes sort of uncomfortably obvious that that's something that needs to happen. Uh, the in the chat, the question about ageism and about discrimination is a real one, and that's why AMA backed away from that because there were real legal concerns with that. Sort of a segue, sort of similar consideration, maybe not procedural and competencies in that way. There probably is just like in every other part of the career spectrum in cardiology, there is also a distribution and a spectrum of competence at any time. And maybe what is made up for in terms of experience and having seen a lot of patients and knowing a lot of things for the senior cardiologist, there may be some concerns as to maybe the senior cardiologist doesn't stay up to date as much, or maybe their practice patterns don't incorporate some of the newer therapies or drugs or approaches. Are there ways that we can address that and maybe make sure that people are staying as up to date as they can be?
Well, of course, certifications and renewal of or maintenance of certification is probably the best way to do that. My concern is that um, even if you're certified, as you sort of alluded to when you raised the question, is it that you don't know what the latest is, or you don't agree with it, or don't want to do it because then that's sort of the rigidity you're talking about. I think in the best of all worlds, you would like to think that rather than trying to legislate this with some draconian measures, the people around you would be reasonable and the person involved would be reasonable, and you would discuss these and so forth and so on, and make decisions about it. Of course, people are people, and sometimes that gets off the rail. But I really do worry about some of these standard testing and so forth, that sometimes people are good doctors and know how to practice medicine, and they don't do well with putting round holes in square pegs, or all that kind of thing. And so I think it's a very tricky issue. And what you would really hope is people are reasonable.
So Dick, you and I are both doing the CMP,
Mhm.
and maybe you could talk a little bit about maybe is that sort of the sweet spot? Is that something maybe that is not too onerous, is formative, and can sort of establish some demonstration of competence?
Um, yeah, and thanks for bringing that up because I have personally found the CMP path to be really a nice way to balance these things at this stage of my career. I am a grand. I guess we're still grandpersons. We're 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 still in that age range where I received unlimited, no time limited certificate or unlimited time certification from ABIM for both internal medicine and for cardiology. Um, you know, we will be though. I believe next year started to be listed as to whether we are maintaining certification both through CME maintenance of certification points and moving toward uh, um, a recertification either by a 10-year exam or by passing the CMP pathway. I found it to be ideal. I you study on your own time. I think to answer George's, question, I think the questions are reasonable. I find myself second guessing some of the question writers as to where the heck this came from. Uh, but that's just a tribute to having written questions myself. Um, but it's flexible, and now there'll be windows of opportunity to take a fairly short uh, open book self-study uh, online examination to demonstrate to yourself that you're up to date on these topics. And the way the CMP is rolling through with cycling on a 5-year cycle through the various topics of cardiology, I think is also a real plus, because you're not trying to learn all of cardiology and then go to an exam center and take a high stakes test. You're taking a finite, digestible piece of knowledge around um, care of the cardiac patients. It's doable. It fits with the busy lives that we all have, even though we're part of the senior section.
Yeah, I think it's an active learning pathway too. So, Melissa, are you doing the CMP?
I am, and I'm sorry that I had to go off camera. I had an urgent page. I am. I think it's outstanding, and I think it's especially, it's really a great opportunity for refreshing, for catching up, for people at all stages of the career. I think that especially for those of us who've been out of fellowship for 20 or more years, I think, things have changed so much, and we're so busy in our clinical lives that we don't necessarily have time to read all the journal articles, and we certainly can't attend all the meetings. So I think it's been very well put together and really delivers a lot of education in addition to sort of the assessment of one's knowledge. So grateful to the college and to the college leaders who really pushed hard for us to be able to have this opportunity.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of work going on to try to make it even better too, and more formative and less burden. So hopefully more to come on that. One of my partners, I asked him, I said, so how are you? What are you doing for maintenance of certification, and how are you getting that all done? And he said, oh, it's simple. I retired, and we certainly don't want that to be the solution. We want to keep very productive, smart people like that in practice. Um, Melissa, you touched on this a little bit, and I think and Sam did too. We've had in the past, certainly we've had this very sort of binary approach where you're either all in or you're all out. Um, but some practices are developing sort of specific step down programs, and I think it was Sam had mentioned something about job sharing. That's sort of one way of doing that. And actually, there are some examples where job sharing may actually be two halves are more than one whole, and actually more productive in that circumstance. But there are also some programs that have, once you sort of declare that you are slowing down, there's a finite path to retirement. What are some of the experiences that you've seen, Melissa, and certainly through the Board of Governors, the people you talk to all the time? What's out there?
I certainly think I've heard some interesting stories, and the first one I would share is that there have been people who have, contemplated and have retired and have actually come back to medicine because they realize there's just this giant emptiness, because they really gained so much, enjoyment, and it found medicine to be so rewarding, and really went through that, the grass is greener. So I've several governors have shared that with me. And then from the experience of, talking to people at different stages of their career, one thing that does seem to work really nicely, and we have done in one of our practices in the community that's part of Mass General, is actually two physicians have shared their time so that each of them is there in the office 3 days a week. They overlap 1 day a week, but on the 2 days that one of them is not there, the other covers their beeper and their any urgent messages or any situations that arise. Neither of these physicians takes call, but they're really able, to your point, each of them is able to generate, and together they generate more work than sort of, in an individual who might be, say, full time, but is only going to be in the office, because they need their administrative time, so they might only be in the office like 2 or 3 days anyway. And they're in there a total of, between the two of them, there's six days a week of combined time. So it's actually worked out really well for our practice. And they've been able to really absorb patients that are new to the system, and they've been able to absorb patients from other physicians who have completely retired. And, both of them are looking forward to staying in this capacity, working for at least the next 5, if not 10 years, because they have a great deal of job satisfaction and they feel like they have equipoise in their lives. They're able to really enjoy their families and their grandchildren, but then they really get to spend time doing what matters to them, and that's taking care of patients with heart disease.
Yeah. I think there's a
I
lot of
have,
creative solutions out there. One of our lead vascular surgeon is an avid mountain climber. And at age 50, he decided that, he wasn't going to be able to climb mountains when he was 60 or 65. So he went part-time and he actually identified a colleague and they started job sharing. The other individual was in his early 60s. But that's worked out beautifully for both of them. And he's near he started this like about 10 years ago. So he's near the point where he's planning to come back full time. And it's, he's sort of had the Benjamin Button approach to cardiology, sort of living it in reverse. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about that. Um, George, the talk a little bit about you're in academic practice. What are some of the other things that people, if they stop doing procedure, they come out of call, what are some other, in addition to additional teaching responsibilities, what are some other things in the academic practices that are opportunities for people later in their career?
well, I think it kind of depends on what they've been doing all along. It's a little hard for interventionalists, I think, to go from being in a very interventional practice to seeing patients every day. Those it's a reasonable change in environment. But I think some people actually continue to practice on a volunteer basis. And I guess one of the things I was going to raise, the academic practices and really large community practices probably have some flexibility, but a lot of the smaller practices that are now owned by um, for-profit hospitals, the question really becomes, is there anything we can do to try to encourage this job sharing and flexibility in some way? Because you've described examples where it just worked out, there was the right person to match with, but that's not always the case. And yet sometimes we lose talent when we don't have the talent to burn. And I'm just wondering if there's any opportunity to work behind the scenes or in the scenes or whatever to address these issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that I think that's something that and Melissa and Dick have both been governors recently of their states and state chapters. I think this is a great opportunity for the chapters to be able to help build those bridges and provide those resources, whether it's at the chapter meeting or, I mean, the great thing, byproduct of COVID is, I mean, we're having webinars like all the time. And I know this has been a subject of one of our state webinars, and so maybe that's a venue for that sort of thing. So um,
And I was interested, if I don't want to change the subject too much, but I'd be interested in everyone's opinion. In a huge rural state, telemedicine is essential, and we haven't addressed that yet.
yeah,
And how to arrange for that to be done equitably, to get paid for it. I really like the team approach, and somebody proposed to me the other day that any cardiologist, but a senior cardiologist could be the head of a command center that directs traffic. That you really need to get on the helicopter, or maybe you should just take your blood pressure pills, and work very closely with nurse practitioners and nurses. And there are many primary care clinics in this state that are run by independent nurse practitioners. Now the AMA gets all been out of shape about scope of practice, but that's better than going to the local witch doctor, I think. I shouldn't say it that way. I love nurse practitioners. I think they want to work with us. And
Yeah.
the college has been very proactive compared to many other segments of our profession in working with nurse practitioners. And I think combine telemedicine with nurse practitioners with cardiology support, sharing patients, not my patients, our patient.
Mhm.
And if he needs to see George for an intervention or an EP or whatever, that it's us. It's not. And when you work as a team, you can play to each person's strong points. And I I like working with nurse practitioners, and I can do it on telemedicine easily.
Well, I think
There
it's
are people here. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There are people here that are 100 miles from the closest cath lab,
yeah.
and they ain't going.
Yeah, no, exactly. There are parts of Indiana like that too,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
um, yeah, well, it's great. Great point that you make, because that's a place where you can really leverage that experience. Be able to sort of assess the situation because you've seen it 1,000 times before. It's not your first goat rodeo when you come across that person in a televisit, and you can, that may lend itself to a certain lifestyle, and maybe there's not so much concern about having to generate the revenue or the RVU. So that can be a great opportunity.
There's even a movement here. We'll go on about it, but we used to have internists that came to the hospital and actually saw patients in the hospital. We don't do that much anymore. We could bring back, if we supported them, general internists could take care of a lot of the heart failure and other things that really we're just not going to have enough cardiologists to do this. Let's be honest about it. It's just not going to happen. May happen in big cities and people with whatever, but it's not going to happen in the rest of America. So we could empower general internists, family practitioners, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, but we need to be part of the team. We can't, I really don't, I'm not saying they should do it on their own. Of course not. But we need to address them and not be, and a lot of this has to do with payment. I hate to say it. If we're not paid to do that, really enough said. The payment system has to be revised to incorporate the team and not individuals after the RVUs.
Um,
End of speech.
Well, we're getting kind of near the end. I want to open up the live questions here in just a minute. He may have dropped off, but I saw that Antonio Chagas was on the call from Brazil, and I was going to ask him what the international experience has been too. And I saw Cesar Herrera was on there as well. I think he may have, I don't know if he's still on or not, but if any of our international colleagues, are there any similarities in your practices?
I'm not international, but I did talk to Dr. Shaggets at some length in this whole course to get an international perspective. And of course, there's lots of variation, but some of them do more than in the United States. They have fixed retirement ages,
Hmm.
and which is different than what we're thinking about. And so it's a little bit different. And I don't know how much they job share. I think a lot of them are forced to retire to give an age. Some of those retirements are created in the government system, and they go out. And there are often separate private practices where they can practice, or they do other teaching or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to this question. Is that true of our VA system?
There's no mandatory
I
retirement in the VA. And matter of fact, I know some senior cardiologists that are working in the VA because
Right.
it's a very convenient place to
Right.
continue
Right.
practicing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you asked
Our
a question
surgeons
about,
tend to go to the VA.
oh, go ahead, George, and finish I was off the VA topic. Okay, well, I'll go back to what I was going to, Ed, you asked a little bit about the value of the chapters, and there's a couple of questions, in the chat box now that are appearing about, um, you know, networking. I have a practice. I'd like to find a successor in my practice. I think the chapters are ideal places to network at the local level. We've had the opportunity on occasions within the last few years to have cardiologists who are practicing well outside of our academic medical center and other cities in the state who wanted to relocate for reasons of family, sort of a reverse migration. They had children or grandchildren who they wanted to be closer to. And in both cases, we were able to hire them into clinical faculty positions to primarily serve as clinicians, one in an outreach site, one in another subspecialty to help us with this clinical care. And that all that networking occurred through the chapters. That's where we learned about it, and I think it's always an invaluable. We tell our fellows it's where you go to network to find a job, but it may be the place to go to network to find your wind down job.
Yeah. Well, let's open up to anybody who has a question who would, you can unmute yourself and actually I probably would prefer also that you put your video on too. And if you have a question, use the hand raising function would be helpful. But there's a couple of interesting comments in the chat box. Experience of leaving practice, starting a research institute, now looking to get back to practice. What are some ideas and some solutions? The issue of locums, locum tenens, qualifications to be certified to work in that space. Those are all great questions, and I would steer you to the senior cardiology section because I think you're probably not alone in those concerns, and there are probably great answers among the members of the section. I don't see anybody with. Does anybody have their hand up? I'm not able to see everybody at one time. Oh, John Brush, there you are. Can you unmute yourself and?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Great session. I'm enjoying it. And I'm a senior cardiologist now, I have to say, and made a transition and just thinking that some of the transitions aren't just merely just cutting back. You can make a transition to something that's completely different, and but you kind of have to plan that out. And so I'm the senior medical director of a research institute and now the chief research officer for a health system. But I got into that by shifting 40% of my time before I really shifted completely. I shifted 40% of my time. I was doing outcomes research in our area and trying to develop a capacity to do outcomes research, and sort of got people's attention. And so ended up talked them into creating the job that I transitioned into. But it's one of the things that people might consider is, creating a job and that you want and working towards that, but proactively working towards that. I still see patients one day a week, which brings up another issue. I'm not totally immersed in clinical cardiology anymore, and how long can I pull that off and remain, competent? I was doing the CMP also. I put that off during COVID. And one of the questions I have now is whether I want to resume that because I'm only seeing patients one day a week and I'm quite busy with my other job that it's kind of hard to think about doing the CMP, and that's something I worry about, whether one day I should eliminate that one day a week completely. But I was just commenting on, sort of making your own luck, I guess, and trying to figure out ways that you can design something to transition to, and there are a lot of opportunities. But one other issue about the whole thing about remaining employed, even though you're moving along, the market forces are going to be pretty strong. my group is begging me to stay in that 1 day a week. They do not want me to go away because they're really short on doctors who can see outpatients, and they're begging me to stay. And I think that the market forces are going to be pretty strong and in favor of people who want to do outpatient work, as a part of a group for years to after the standard retirement age.
Oh,
So,
great.
thank you.
So you can be president of the United States, you can be a Supreme Court justice, and you can see patients 1 day a week in the office. So that's a good combination. Dr. Gordon, I saw you had your hand up. I think you're on mute there.
You hear me?
Yeah.
So I practiced for 20 years in a big, large cardiology group with cardiovascular surgeons, or like 25 docs. 6 years ago, I left to open a preventive clinic, and now I'm wanting to get back into doing some locums work. But because I haven't worked in a quote cardiology only practice for the last 6 years, every locums company that I talk to says, well, we can't get you credentialed. You need to have people that you've worked with within the last 2 years in cardiology for us to credential you. So I've been trying literally for the last 6 months to get a locums position. And every time I'm turned down just because I haven't been, quote, in a cardiology office for 2 years. So does anybody have any suggestions as to what I need to do to be able to get into that program?
Well, I would number one, I would say just what John Brush was talking about is that there'd probably be a lot of people who'd be very interested in having you work part time, whether that's a traditional locums or not, and probably would be a little bit more flexible in addressing those criteria. Um, but other than that, I was, earlier I was saying I was referring back to the section. It may be very worthwhile getting involved in the section because I'm sure you're not the only person who has gone through that, and that may be a resource. I don't know off the top of my head how to address that, but I bet there are others in the section who have had to sort of wrestle with the same thing.
Let me make a comment, two comments. One is that I do know some physicians have gone to a hospital or so forth, and they've worked out where they see patients. They kind of do a mini internship and get signed off in that way. And that would be, I think, my first comment about what to do, whether you could partner in somebody's practice for a while, or just so there was somebody that was providing oversight and then could say, yes, I've worked with them. You need a hospital one because you're going to be a hospitalist. The other issue that I would ask, though, is telemedicine has come up a couple of times, and some people have done it through the pandemic. Some have never done it, and particularly senior cardiologists who are used to seeing a patient and they even have a black bag. I don't know. Might be a little uncomfortable with that, and I'm wondering if I'd like some feedback from people if that's something that the senior section should organize as a seminar on how do you see patients effectively in telemedicine or something for people who might want to do that. Do you think there's a need and would it be useful? I just need some feedback.
Well, I actually do that right now, but we have a small concierge preventive practice. And seeing the patients online through telemedicine isn't an issue for us. We do that all the time. But it's just a matter of getting back into more of the clinical cardiology. And I'm not really looking for an inpatient position. I'm really looking more just to help out seeing patients in an outpatient setting. But even with that, I'm still running into these roadblocks. They say, well, like your volume of echoes hasn't been adequate for the last several years, so we
Yeah,
can't.
the credentialing piece, and that is something that we probably need to, um, we need to think about how we, bridge those things. I think George's suggestion about sort of late mentoring almost is kind of an interesting one. We have only a couple more minutes. There are two other questions out there. Dr. DeSilvi, you have a question. Do you want to turn your?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And hi, George. And I think John Brush and I were in medical school together at Columbia quite some time ago. One resource that I think we failed to talk about is for the last, starting in 2000 and One, I have been the cardiologist for, I'm now up to 4 critical access hospitals.
Hmm.
These are small community hospitals which have a large drawing area and a very exciting and very practical and extensive cardiology practice. One of the challenges I've faced is recruiting people to work in those practices. We finally have been able to recruit a, George, you'll appreciate it, a retired interventionist who got tired of her back pain, so she's now working for us. But it's something to keep in mind, and I think the college needs to sort of look at this as a resource, because I would say there every state has a fair number. I work in Maine right now, um, and will probably eventually retire from the position I'm in, but it's something to look at.
Great. And I think, Thad, are you still there? You had your hand up too.
Hello. My name's Peter Greger. I apologize for coming in late. I'm on the island of Saipan, which most of you have never heard of. It's in the same time zone as Brisbane, Australia. And I got to the point about a year ago where I was totally frustrated with HMOs and the business aspects of medicine. Started looking around. I even looked at Catholic missions overseas, anywhere. I stumbled upon Saipan. Saipan is the epicenter of rheumatic heart disease in the United States. It's a commonwealth similar to Puerto Rico, located about 100 miles from Guam. I feel like I've died and gone to heaven. I am doing pure cardiology, a 4x10 schedule. And after work, I go 5 minutes and I'm dipping my toes in the Philippine Sea. The people are so appreciative. And for the first time since medical school, it's wonderful to come to work joyful and be happier and happier as the day goes on. There are such places. I know American Samoa is looking. We can certainly take at least one cardiologist here, and I just stumbled upon it. And I wish you the best of luck finding places like this. But if you get imaginative enough and frustrated enough at the delivery of the healthcare system, there are little gems like this.
So you and Dr. Gordon may want to hook up here on the, this is like turned into like sort
I'd
of,
be delighted to talk with you.
yeah, this is like the dating game here. Thad, are you
Dr.
still there? Thad,
Yeah, Ed.
we'll give you the last word because we're wrapping up here.
All right, thank you, Ed. I have a one-off thing that I've been doing in my practice now, and that is I'm the structural heart disease echo person. So I'm basically on a contract with my group to be available for the Watchman cases, for the mitral clip, et cetera. My career was always interventional, but I managed to pick it up. So it's really helped our group out a lot because obviously not everybody can have that time for all those structural cases. So just wanted to add that to the database of things that can be done.
Fascinating. So that is quite contrary to my earlier point that perhaps people who are, in hyper subspecialized areas, they become more generalists later on. But you're showing us that you can perhaps pick up a new sort of hyper subspecialized area. That's and create a niche. That's great. Well,
My
we're out of,
partners tell
pardon?
my partners tell me not to quit. I just left our malpractice insurance people, and they said I could work at least another year. So we'll see.
Well, we've got plenty of room for you here in Indianapolis. So if you ever get bored of Mississippi, come up here. So
Thank you.
I just want to thank our panel, George Vetrovec, Sam Wan, Melissa Wood, Dick Kovacs. This was really a stimulating conversation, and I think really an important issue. And I think we just scratched the surface of it. And I'll put in a blatant plug really for three things here. One, for the section, I would really explore the section. Number two is coming up in February will be the CV Summit. This is a topic that's often talked about, and it's also a great place to network regarding these issues. And then similarly, get engaged in MedAxiom. Have your practice get engaged in MedAxiom. These are very important issues that every practice is going to face in terms of the gray tsunami that we see in cardiology. So it's better to get out and ahead of it and exploit these opportunities rather than suffer the consequences. So with that, we'll say good night and thanks to everybody.